What the regulators haven't done is really waded into the waters of looking at anti-competitive practices, again, on the producer. It's like trying to be a referee and provide rules because one team is playing football and the other team is playing basketball. And I'm going to pass rules that are going to apply to both games. And then magically these rules are going to work. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. What is the difference between regulation and legislation? And so to break this down, legislation would be when you pass a law. That would be when Congress puts a bill into the House and then into the Senate, and then the president signs that, and this bill becomes a law. When you create a law and you actually have legislation that comes to the floor of Congress, what that's doing is putting broad-based rules and then some corresponding possible penalties if those rules are broken, and then that gets passed as a law. On a federal basis. Same thing could happen on a statewide basis. But what we saw, say, with GDPR in the EU, or what we've seen with the 1996 law, the kind of Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is what gives these platforms a lot of safe harbor. If infringing content on YouTube is posted to YouTube, YouTube can't get sued because that content was infringing on IP law. YouTube needs to take best practices to remove the content if someone notifies them that it does violate IP rights. But YouTube can't necessarily be held liable for violating IP rights of someone else. And so that was the DMCA law that was passed, I think, in 1996. Now, what you see with these laws is they're pretty broad. They're not going to be specifically focused on one company. Or specifically on, say, product marketplaces or content platforms. And now regulation is different in the sense that the regulators would be, for example, the FTC, in the United States, which the FTC is now investigating multiple of these tech monopolies. The FTC is really the one that settled with Facebook on the privacy violations for $5 billion a couple weeks ago. And when we say regulation is a better way to handle tech monopoly anti-competitive practices than legislation, what that's saying is empower regulators. Empower regulators like the FTC. And why is that? Because what the FTC can do through regulation is they can say, here are the regulations for Amazon. And they can make it very specific. They can make it very specific on a specific company. They can make it very specific on a certain industry or, say, product marketplaces, versus legislation is going to be much more broad sweeping. We saw this from Elizabeth Warren, who was saying that we should have just broad sweeping legislation that if you make more than, $20 billion in revenue, then you're considered a monopoly and certain, rules
the analogy
will apply
I would
to you.
use here is the legislation is what sets the rules of the game. The regulation is the referees actually interpreting and enforcing that. So they're the ones that are on the ground actually making these decisions, what's a foul, what's not, that kind of stuff. So that they're actually the ones interpreting and enforcing those rules.
And the regulators have the authority to act on a lot of these transgressions. So the privacy violations from the Facebooks of the world, they didn't need new legislation to go after Facebook and find them and all these kinds of things. So the regulators already have a lot of power. What the regulators haven't done is really waded into the waters of looking at anti-competitive practices, again, on the producer. And that's what the EU just did a couple of weeks ago with Miss Vestager, saying that we're going to look into Amazon and how Amazon uses data from third-party sellers in its marketplace, and whether it's using that data inappropriately to compete in an unfair manner. And that is where, again, regulation could be provided to say, if you are a dominant product marketplace like Amazon, and you can have certain thresholds that could be passed to qualify as a dominant or monopoly status marketplace or platform business, then here are the types of rules that you have to comply to according to the regulator, the FTC. Same thing could be done for a Facebook, a YouTube, a Google, a Twitter. When you have this monopoly status, winner take all positioning in a market, what is appropriate, and this was what Zuckerberg has literally asked for just in June, to be regulated about what is appropriate to take down content that might be harmful or abusive versus where is that a violation of free speech. And right now, Facebook has tried to come up with its own rules on where those lines are, and it's very hard to get those rules correct. And that is really the role of a regulator, of the government, is to come in and help provide guidance about what is fair and what is inappropriate.
Be the referee.
Exactly. So that would be the big difference. And the regulation is specific. The referees can provide. It's like trying to be a referee and provide rules because one team is playing football and the other team is playing basketball. Right. And I'm going to pass rules that are going to apply to both games. And then magically these rules are going to work. I mean, it just doesn't work that way, right? I mean,
where you need legislation is if the regulators did not have the legal authority to pursue certain actions that they needed. I don't think that's necessarily the case right now. And, if there's a case to be made that, okay, the FTC or the Department of Justice does not have the authority to go after something, that's when you would say, all right, we need legislation to enable that. But it doesn't seem like we're there now because obviously they are looking at these companies. They are figuring out how to regulate them. There's a lot of actions in place. It's just they haven't done that until really this year.
Right. And I mean, that stuff is just getting started. But again, it's just unfortunate that the EU is starting to take the lead on these things. And it just seems like the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and the FTC, from what we've been hearing, are more so just continued to focus on privacy as opposed to really looking at who are the producers, who are the sellers, who are the content creators, and how are these platforms competing unfairly in that arena.